Welcome to Pre-Assignment 2 for the History of the American Dream, and this is designed to help you get ready so that you can get the most out of that class during Discover Weekend. And so I'm going to be your tour guide or your host as I take you through 12 major events in United States history. And I am super excited because I'm sure on a regular basis you wake up and think to yourself, what I really want to do today is to spend about 30 minutes of my time learning about history. And because of that, I am here to make your wildest dreams come true and spend 30 minutes with you talking about United States history. So, before we launch into the actual historical events, this is just to provide you with a little bit of a framework of how this presentation will be organized. First, there'll be a slide with some date ranges. Next, it'll tell you what happened during that date range with a brief description of the event and a picture. And the next slide will give you some additional facts about the event. And as I stated before, there's 12 total. They're in chronological order from what happened first to what happened last. And a couple of times, some events are happening around the same time period, so some of the dates kind of overlap. So our first event happened between 1776 and 1783. This is the American Revolutionary War, where the original British colonies in the area fought to become an independent nation. Some key points or some additional facts are that there were 13 original colonies, and for lack of a better term, they didn't really hang out with one another. They were pretty spread out, and because of that, they had very different circumstances that led to them having very different cultures and very different ideas about how things should be done. And so the significance of that is that when they decided to go to war, it was super hard to get them to unite and trust each other and come to a consensus about how things should be done. And we're going to talk a little bit more about why the war started in the first place next. And so the colonists at the time, many of them felt like it was wrong that King George, who was the King of England at the time, had so much control of their lives when he didn't really know what they needed and what it was like to live there. And he didn't allow them to send a representative to speak in their behalf, and yet he was taxing them. And so they came up with this tag phrase or this phrase that said, no taxation without representation. And so as the taxes were increasing, the 13 colonies sent delegates together to come up with a way to find a solution. And they ended up sending a letter to King George basically saying, you should reconsider, what you're doing is unfair. And it made him really angry. He felt like, I've taken good care of you guys, and this is kind of a slap to the face. You guys should be thanking me for everything that I'm doing for you. And he kind of responded by saying, fine, I'm going to crack down and create even stricter and more unfair laws, and I'm going to increase taxes. So colonists thought, we tried to do this peacefully. It's time to cut ties and become our own country. And so at the time, about a third of the colonists felt that way. Another third were on the fence. They thought, yeah, I don't really know that I like the way the government is headed. However, do I want to go to war over it? Probably not. So I'll just kind of be on the fence. And the other third were actually loyal to Great Britain, and they were called loyalists and did everything they could to help the British side of the war. However, they were able to gain their independence, and afterwards there was kind of this now what moment. We're our own independent nation. What are we going to do? What is our new government going to look like? So some people felt like if we're going to survive and be protected against bigger countries that might try to take us over, and if we're going to do well, we should become one united nation. Yes, we're very different, but those differences can make us stronger as we use each other to become united. And the other side of things was like, we just fought this big long war to get rid of a king. I'm not super excited about the idea of having some sort of central government that controls all of us. I think that we should all be our own country so that we can do things the way that makes sense for our individual needs and circumstances. So the way that we were able to kind of come to an agreement and become a united nation or become a united set of states, hence the name United States of America, a document was drafted called the Bill of Rights, and it had 10 rights or 10 amendments that was guaranteed to every citizen no matter what. And this document kind of gave the side of people who were worried about a strong government the peace they needed, knowing, okay, this lets us know that the government will never become so strong that we're back in the same problem as we were before with some sort of king telling us what to do. And ironically, one of those rights, or not, that's not necessarily ironically, but it should be noted that one of those rights was the Second Amendment, which was kind of in the context of a strong militia, that people had the right to bear arms. So today you might hear a lot about gun rights in that debate. And on the pro gun side, people are saying that is written in our Constitution. One of the reasons we were able to become a united country in the first place was that we were guaranteed we would always have the right to bear arms, and that should not ever be messed with no matter what. On the other side of things, people who want to crack down on gun control are saying, look, the Constitution says you have the right to bear arms. And what does the right to bear arms really mean? We need to look into, how do we translate? Does that mean some people can have hunting rifles or a small handgun to protect themselves? Or does that mean that people can just really easily go and buy semi automatic weapons? And so that kind of might help you provide a little bit more information about that gun debate that you might be hearing about. So we're going to go ahead and talk about the next event, which happened between 1838 and 1839. This is called the Trail of Tears, and Andrew Jackson was the president of the United States at the time, and he forced Native peoples out of this land so he could give it to other people. And ironically, this guy is on our $20 bill right now, but they're looking to change that to being someone called Harriet Tubman, who was a woman who helped people escape slavery in the South and come and live in the North, where slavery was not allowed. And so hopefully that we'll be able to make that change in the near future, because I'm not super jazzed every time I pull out a $20 bill. Anyways, we're going to get back on track here. So the key points that we want to talk about here is actually, instead of talking more about the Trail of Tears, I'm going to give you some other examples of when Native peoples were mistreated by the U.S. government. So there are times when tribes were promised new land in exchange for where they were living, but often they were either not given new land, or the new land they were given was really uninhabitable, meaning it was not a good place to live for whatever reason. It might be hard to grow crops or hard to find food, or it might have a really bad climate, like either too hot or too cold. So they were kicked out of their good land in exchange for either no land or really bad land. Another instance of how they were mistreated, and this is the one that gets me the most, there were laws that allowed settlers to kill Native peoples, and even in instances where they were paid to do so. So back then, you could kill a Native person and you would scalp them, which means you would cut off the top layer of skin attached to the skull, including their hair, and you would bring that as proof that you had done this, and you would be paid in exchange for the scalp. And I kind of think of it really similar to nowadays when people are paid for wolf pelts, because it proves that they're getting rid of a nuisance or a dangerous species in the area that's going to make life better. And I just think the parallel is really similar, and it's honestly tragic that this law was ever in place. Another way that they were mistreated was that the Bureau of Indian Affairs, or the part of the government that was in charge of relationships with Native people, was originally created by the Secretary of War. And the significance of that is basically the mindset was the assumption that any sort of relationship with Native people would be violent or aggressive or warlike. And so that kind of shows you the mindset of the government at the time. Often there were other times huge amount of tribes were forced out of their land. They would make treaties with Native people and then break their end of it or not hold up their end of it. And in addition, Native people were denied full citizenship and other rights for many, many years. And so that's going to take us to our next event, which is between 1846 and 1848. This is the Mexican-American War, and if any au pair out there is from Mexico, I'm going to apologize ahead of time. So basically, this was some events that led to the war and resulted in the United States gaining a lot of land. So what happened is Texas became an independent country from Mexico in 1836, and they asked to join the U.S., and initially the U.S. said no, but later on changed its mind and allowed Texas to become a part of the Union, meaning it became a state within the United States. And Mexico had warned that this would mean war. They were not happy about that. And at the same time, President Polk wanted to make the United States bigger, so he asked Mexico if they could buy some of their land, and Mexico said no. So he got, I guess, sneaky about this and wanted to find a way he could get that land anyways. So he sent some U.S. troops into disputed land. You'll notice I've used quotation marks there because the territory between Mexico and the United States, sometimes with those border areas, there can be gray areas or no man's zone, or can be a little bit confusing about exactly where the United States ends and Mexico starts. But it's in quotation marks because it had been previously agreed that yes, this part for sure belonged to Mexico. So when he sent the troops there, of course, the Mexican troops, viewed this as an invasion and attacked. And President Polk was pretty excited about this because now he had a way to go to Congress and say, hey, we can declare war on Mexico. They've attacked us. Because he couldn't declare war on his own, he needed Congress to agree. And so they sent an official declaration of war to Mexico, but Mexico did not respond with their own declaration of war on the U.S. The United States pushed their way into Mexico and drew up the Treaty of Guadalupe. Basically, Mexico had to recognize that Texas was now part of the U.S. They redrew those territorial lands so that the U.S. Area was larger than it was before, and Mexico agreed to sell that land to President Polk, or to the United States, that he had wanted in the first place. So just to give you an idea of how much land that was, that includes what is now California, Arizona, New Mexico, Colorado, Nevada, Utah, and even parts of Wyoming. And to add insult to injury, gold was discovered in California just a few days before Mexico sold it to the United States. So all that gold was now the property of the U.S. instead of Mexico. And so that is why I started this off with an apology to any au pair listening that is from Mexico. And that is going to bring us to our next event between 1861 and 1865. This is the American Civil War. It is mainly over the issue of slavery, but for a while some southern states left the U.S., and the northern states responded by attacking them and trying to force them back into the United States so they become a unified nation. And we're going to talk a little bit about how this came to be. At the time, every state got to decide if they were going to be a free state or if they're going to be a slave state that allowed slavery. And people viewed this as a state right. And they felt like if the federal government ever said that everybody had to be a free state, that would be making the federal government too big, and kind of going back to the American Revolutionary War, that fear that they never wanted the central government to feel like a king again. They felt like every state knew it was best for what they needed and that they should have the most control over how things were done. So in 1860, Abraham Lincoln won the presidential election, and he was anti-slavery. And although he wanted to eventually get rid of it, he knew it needed to go about gradually and slowly. So one of his first acts as president was to say that territories, which are places that belong to the U.S. but weren't states, would be free areas, that they would not be allowed to have slavery. And so although this didn't end slavery, it stopped it from spreading. Many southern states kind of flipped out and said, hey, central government's getting too big. As I talked about, they never wanted to have a king-like situation. You've overstepped your bounds. We're going to become our own country. And they kind of viewed it as very similar to the American Revolutionary War. You've gone too far, so we become our own country. And they called themselves the Confederacy. So the Confederacy then attacked a military base called Fort Sumter, where Abraham Lincoln has set a bunch of troops down there to kind of keep an eye on things. And they claimed it as his own fort. And Abraham Lincoln sent the militia down there to get rid of these rebels and attack these Confederate soldiers. And at that point, 4 more slave states joined the Confederacy. So now there were 11 states that had seceded or left the United States and become their own country. So Abraham Lincoln at this point said, look, if we just allow states to leave the U.S. whenever they don't agree with something, pretty soon we're going to be a fragmented nation and a bunch of tiny countries instead of one united country. And he had the famous phrase saying that a house divided upon itself cannot stand, will start to fall apart and become really weak. And so he sent an army to force those states to become part of the U.S. again. Now, during the war, Abraham Lincoln actually was able to pave the way to end slavery and kind of change the point of the war being about freeing slaves and not just uniting the nation. So he issued what was called the Emancipation Proclamation, and it was considered an act of war, which the president can do, and he didn't need Congress to agree with him. And what it basically said was, any state that has left the United States, if you don't join our country by this time, I'm declaring all your slaves free. And you might say, well, they're not part of his country anymore. He doesn't have the authority to do that. And he didn't. But of course, if he were to win the war, that ends slavery and in those states. And also, it weakens the South, because if you're a slave and you hear about that, you're thinking, wow, I'm going to do everything I can to make sure the North wins. And so, of course, the southern states did not rejoin the nation at the time that Abraham Lincoln gave them to. And so he issued the second Emancipation Proclamation that said, "You didn't listen. I now declare all your slaves free." And he also allowed blacks to join the Union Army, and this weakened the South and increased the North's military power, and also again kind of changed the war to being more about slavery than just about reuniting the nation. So when they won in 1865, they were able to pass the 13th Amendment that officially ended slavery for everybody. And you might be thinking, well, the Emancipation Proclamation did that, but that only applied to the states that had left. There were still a few border states that did allow slavery that did not leave the United States and join the Confederacy. And so this proclaimed freedom to even those states. So now the whole United States has outlawed slavery officially. So there's some interesting things that happened because of this. So as I said, the proclamation set the stage for this amendment, but it kind of, not that it backfired, but it had some really sad consequences because of it. Many people were upset because they felt like, first of all, the South is destroyed. The war was happening on their land, and many farms and everything were completely destroyed. And it was going to take a lot of time and work to make them fixed to the point of growing crops. And now they had no cheap or free labor to do that. So this destroyed the southern economy and also influenced the North because now they have to pay more money for their crops. In addition, as I keep talking about and bringing up, there's this whole kind of American culture of like, we don't want a big government to tell us what to do. Everyone should decide for themselves what is best for their local circumstances. And they felt like this fear that this was the starting point of the federal government becoming too big and eventually taking over states' rights. And even though this was a huge one for human rights, it would launch years of racism and mistreatment as kind of a response to it that would later have to be dealt with or challenged by the civil rights movement. So we're going to kind of take a break and come back to that idea of racism in the South. And we're going to talk about World War I, which happened between 1914 and 1918. Of course, this is not strictly a United States event, but we're going to talk a little bit about why the United States got involved in this World War in the first place. So at the time, most Americans felt like the best policy was for the United States to stay out of global affairs and stay kind of neutral and independent so that we didn't put ourselves in dangerous situations or take on other people's problems, that we're focusing on our own problems. And so because of this, people didn't want to join World War I. The way that, or the two events that happened to get the U.S. involved despite this attitude was the sinking of the Lusitania, which was a cargo ship with no military purpose. A German U-boat sunk it, and many of the passengers on board were from the U.S., and so that really outraged a lot of Americans. The second event was that Germany wrote a telegram to Mexico basically stating, we want to attack the United States, but we can't land in the United States and attack them. It's not safe for us. So we'd like to land in your country and then turn around and launch our attack. And so some United States spies intercepted that telegram and were able to kind of clue in that they were thinking about doing that. And so the United States decided to join the war. Because they were part of the war effort, at the end of it, they were able to influence the Treaty of Versailles. And so this was the first time the U.S. kind of had a big role in global affairs. The next event was from 1929 to 1939. This is the Great Depression, which is just basically when the economy completely shut down in the U.S. So some events that led to this was, first, the middle section of the United States is where a lot of our crops are grown, and there was a huge drought. So obviously there was some crop failure, and the food became more scarce. In fact, it was called the Dust Bowl because it was so windy and dry at the time, and it was just kicking up a lot of that dust. The second thing that happened is the stock market crashed, and so many people lost their investments, and suddenly they were very afraid, like, the only way to make sure that I have my money is if it's physically in my hand. So many people went to banks and tried to withdraw all their savings. And as you know, many banks, actually all banks, they don't just take your money and set it in the safe and leave it there. They wouldn't make any money. They take your money and they spend it so that they can make more money. So at any given time, not everyone's money is physically at the bank. So when everybody comes and tries to get their money, of course the bank runs out of cash. And so many people show up to withdraw their savings and there's no money left for them. And because the bank gave all the money out, they have to shut down and there's no way for them to ever recover people's money and give it to them. So now people have lost their investments and their savings, and there's less crops and less food. And so the president at the time, he didn't really do much about it. He felt like the federal government doesn't have the right or the power or the resources to get involved, and I'm just not going to do anything. So his popularity diminished, and when the time came to elect a new president, Franklin Delano Roosevelt promised to do something about the Great Depression, and so he won the election. He instigated a set of new policies and programs called the New Deal. It was kind of the New Deal with the American people, where the federal government was able to have a way to increase jobs, provide programs that were able to give money out to people who needed a leg up or couldn't find a job or were injured on the job, and things like that. And so this was kind of, people kind of viewed this with mixed emotions. On one hand, people were really excited and felt like it was a huge move that the president cared about them and wanted to do something to help them. On the other side, that same theme of we don't want the federal government to become too big, we want state rights to be the main power. People felt like this was another way that the federal government was overstepping its bounds and becoming too big and would continue to become too big. Around this time, between 1939 and 1945, was World War II. And again, we'll talk a little bit about the United States' involvement in that World War, which started with the bombing of the military base in Hawaii by Japan. So, some key points. Just like with World War I, most Americans still felt like, hey, let's not get involved. We have our own problems, especially in light of the Great Depression. They felt like, how can we go fight this war when we can't even put food on our own table? And we lost so many lives in World War I. Let's just stay out of it this time. At the time, President Hoover was really good friends with Winston Churchill, and even though most Americans felt like, let's not get involved, President Roosevelt felt like eventually we're going to have to get involved. There's no way we're not going to get mixed up into this. So he did everything he could to help Britain and also prepare the United States to one day enter the war. And as predicted, we did enter the war because Japan started its eastward expansion into the Pacific Ocean as the United States was still having its westward expansion into the Pacific Ocean. And eventually they kind of met up and things were getting heated. So the United States said, hey, we're going to quit selling you oil. And Japan was like, wow, we can't really survive without your oil. And so they responded by bombing Pearl Harbor. And interestingly enough, we kind of had word through our spies that an attack would happen on Pearl Harbor, but the intelligence or the spies at the time had worked out that it was going to be through sabotage, meaning they thought someone was going to kind of sneak on the base and blow things up or destroy some of the planes and boats and other military machines. And so to defend themselves from this kind of attack, they put all the airplanes in one area, parked them wingtip to wingtip, put a big gate around them, and armed soldiers to protect them. And ironically, in an effort to try to protect themselves, things ended up being worse because when it was an outright attack and not sabotage, and Japanese planes show up and start blowing things up, the United States had no planes that they could get to defend themselves, so it actually made things even worse. But after the attack, the United States declared war on Japan, and Germany and Italy, of course, were Japan's allies and declared war on the United States. The United States enters the war, and they had a really big chance to influence the post-war treaties and increase their global influence. And ironically, many people didn't want to go to war because of the Great Depression and felt like they had their own problems, but entering the war gave the economy the boost it needed to officially end the Great Depression. Right after World War II, we entered this, basically 50-year era known as the Cold War, which was basically the USSR and the United States competing for being the global superpower and kind of trying to block each other's growth within the global, between their growing and their global influence. So basically, the United States didn't like the USSR or Russia. They didn't like the way Stalin governed his country. On the flip side, the USSR felt like the United States kind of snubbed them and didn't treat them like a legitimate global member. Also, they were mad that the United States took so long to enter World War II because that meant that Russia kind of bore the brunt for stopping Hitler's progress for a while, which cost millions of Russian lives. And so Russia began expanding, and America felt like Russia was trying to rule the world, and they were kind of afraid it was another Hitler situation where they were just going to keep growing and growing. And on the other side, Russia kind of felt like the U.S. was being hypocritical because the United States was also expanding and also getting more involved in global issues. So the United States felt like Russia had to be stopped and employed a containment policy. Basically, they didn't want any other countries to become communist and started backing smaller countries that might become communist so that they could decrease Russian influence and power. Both countries started making a lot of weapons in preparation of a time when they might actually physically go to war. And so they started collecting a lot of nuclear arms or creating a lot of nuclear arms. There's a great Dr. Seuss book called The Better Butter Battle, and it's about these two areas. One butters their toast on the top of the bread, one butters their toast on the bottom, and they don't like each other and feel like, they're going to eventually try to take us over and make us do things their way. So they start stockpiling weapons, and it's Dr. Seuss's way of kind of commenting on the Cold War and how silly and ridiculous he felt like it was. The war even applied to space. Both countries started putting a lot of money into their space programs because they felt like here is this big open frontier that could really give us an edge in a military sense if we ever went to war. So when Russia launched the first satellite into space, Sputnik, Americans panicked. They felt like now they're spying on us. They can attack us from space. We have no way to defend ourselves. It was a huge time of paranoia and fear. My mom grew up during this time, and she remembers in school having to do drills where they would go into bomb shelters to prepare in case Russia ever attacked them. And there were movies and books written about how Russia might attack, and there's just a ton of paranoia. And so the United States responded by putting even more money into our space program, NASA, that would eventually allow Americans to land on the moon. And the Cold War slowly began to end as both countries started to change their policies, but really it was when the Soviet Union fell that the Cold War ended for good. During this time period and ongoing now today was the Civil Rights Movement. As we talked about during the slide about the 13th Amendment, Southern states were quite racist and continued to provide a situation that was not equal or fair for African Americans. And so this was challenged by many African American leaders who were fighting for equal treatment. So, as stated, at the end of the Civil War, the federal government, which was a Republican government at the time, and when I use the term Republican and Democrat for this slide, bear in mind that both parties have changed a lot since then. So what they believed and did back then is very different to what they believe and do now. But they kind of were able to take control of even the local governments in the South and make them Republican so that they could instigate a lot of policies and laws that would make sure that African Americans' transition from slavery to freedom was smooth and fair. And they called this the Reconstruction era because they also were trying to rebuild the South and help its economy since it just lost its free labor. So those strict laws led the South to become even more hateful and prejudiced against African Americans. The KKK, or the Ku Klux Klan, was formed, which is those people with the big white cloaks that were pointed that would walk around with crosses and burn people's houses. These strict laws and controls kind of just backfired and made the South hate the North and hate African Americans even more. So eventually, the Democrats were able to retake control of their own kind of local governments, and they basically did the opposite of what had been done. They changed all the laws and policies to be purposefully racist and prevent African Americans from having a fair and equal treatment. So eventually, by the 1960s, leaders came together in an effort to change this. So two big examples of this are the Montgomery bus boycott. Rosa Parks and Martin Luther King kind of came up with this idea to have a bus boycott. And to kick it off, she purposely sat in the front of the bus and would not give up her seat to a white person. And at the time, that was against the law, so she was arrested. And so, in response, there was this huge boycott that no one would ride those buses because they felt like their policies were unfair, because they were unfair. And so, thousands walked to work. They got up extra early. They would have to carry all their groceries or, have walk with their small children everywhere. It was a huge sacrifice, but they were able to maintain enough people and do this for long enough that the bus system was becoming broke and losing a ton of money, and that forced them to change their policy and allow anybody to sit wherever they would like on the bus. Another big example, and of course there's more than this, but these are just the two we're going to talk about, is thousands marched on Washington to the Abraham Lincoln Memorial, which is symbolic since he ended slavery. And their point was specifically to focus on financial equality, where they would be paid the same wages and be provided the same job opportunities. And you might have heard of Martin Luther King's famous I Have a Dream speech. and this is the place and the time that he gave that. Also during this time, between 1955 and 1975, was the Vietnam War. This is directly tied to that idea that America had to stop Russia from growing, and Vietnam was, might become a communist country, so they sent troops to prevent that from happening. So what led to this is, like I said, it was kind of the containment policy of stopping the spread of communism and Russia's influence. And the reason that this was even a discussion in Vietnam is they became independent from France, and also Japan had had troops there during World War II and they left. So all of a sudden there's this power vacuum or this opportunity for somebody to take control of Vietnam. So there was a civil war. There were two kind of groups. One wanted a more democratic government, one wanted a communist government. And so the United States obviously wanted the Republican government to win, and they, as well as other countries, sent troops to support them. On the other side, China supported this communist rule of Ho Chi Minh and wanted him to win. So during the war, there was a lot of opposition. Many United States citizens felt like, we have our own problems. Why are you so worried about the rest of the world instead of making sure that we are a strong, good country and take care of our own people? It's none of our business. It's expensive. We shouldn't have so much power and control over the rest of the world. So at the time, there was a draft, meaning if you were over 18 and male, you might be sent to war against your own wishes. So some people fled to Canada. Other people failed the entrance test into the military that would check to make sure you were emotionally and physically able to serve. And many entered college because if you're in college, you couldn't be drafted. Others were even more direct. Instead of just trying to get out of going to the war, they organized rallies, marches, and protests aimed at showing their discontent with America being involved in the Vietnam War. And soldiers who were returning from Vietnam were really poorly treated. And instead of kind of that normal status as a veteran being highly respected in a community, they were actually despised and made fun of and mistreated. And kind of interestingly enough, instead of just being about the war, pretty soon it became a broad social movement where there was a huge group of people that were trying to change American culture in general and challenging many of the current U.S. practices and policies. This is where you see kind of the hippie movement, make love, not war, kind of some more sexual freedoms, more drug use, more social justice, trying to treat everybody equally. And so it kind of somehow became more about just the Vietnam War and was a movement to change a lot about American policies and kind of aimed at making things better in the U.S. itself. And that brings us to our 12th and final event, which was in 2001 on September 11th. An Al Qaeda terrorist group sent 4 hijacked planes into 3 locations: the Twin Towers, the Pentagon, and a 4th plane was meant for the White House. And we'll talk a little bit more about why it didn't actually ever make it there. But on this morning, 3,000 people were killed. And you might be surprised to hear that there were more than 2 planes. And the reason that we focus mostly on the Twin Towers is because that's where most of the people were killed during the attack. When the first plane hit the tower, most people thought it was a freak accident. Newscasters were videotaping that first building burning and talking about this horrible tragedy and wondering what in the world happened to have this kind of accident. And as they're videotaping this, you can see on the videotapes that second plane hitting the second tower. And at this point, everybody realizes this is on purpose. And everybody started panicking, like, what's going to happen next? Like, everyone felt so vulnerable and afraid because this was like a new way of attack for Americans and never experienced anything like this. And there was a lot of fear. And because of that kind of fear, a lot of Americans could tell you exactly where they were when they heard this news. I was in my kitchen making breakfast. My mom yells up at me to run up the stairs, and we're watching this. And she was so afraid. She didn't want me to go to school that day. Eventually, I did go, and we all just watched the news all day, kind of just like dumbstruck that this could even be possible and that this had happened. And so, even though this was really tragic, there was a lot of admirable, selfless acts that were pretty incredible on the part of both regular citizens and first responders. And first responders refers to people like police officers or paramedics or firemen. So, when those Twin Towers were on fire, many people rushed up the stairs, both citizens and first responders, trying to get people who were trapped out. And many people lost their own lives in the process of trying to save others. And in addition to that, we talked a little bit about that fourth plane that was meant to hit the White House. And the passengers on board realized what was happening, and they tried to take control of the plane, and it crashed into the countryside. And even though everybody on the plane died in that crash, they prevented it from crashing into the White House and killing many other lives. And so, even after the event, there was this huge sense of American unity and patriotism. People were more likely to be aware of one another, to be more understanding, to do more selfless acts. Like, for example, my brother lives in New York and he was there at the time, and he said, typically when you get on a New York subway, everyone's kind of in their own little world and excited to have their own seat, and they're not going to give up that seat for any reason. And for a while, people were really eager to give up their seat for maybe someone who had a lot of groceries or looked like they didn't feel well or had small children. And so even though it's like kind of a small thing, I just feel like it kind of is a good way to show how it really changed America for a time to become a better place as people came together and tried to be more kind and understanding and reach out to one another. And so that takes us to the end of our kind of tour of some major United States events. I hope you were able to learn a little bit more and help prepare you for our upcoming weekend. We're looking forward to getting to know you better and sharing the weekend with you in our upcoming Discover Weekend. And I hope you enjoy the rest of your day.